Data cleanliness in a spreadsheet can be really difficult to achieve, especially when you're collaborating with multiple people. Now, dropdowns are a big help in that by normalizing the data that people are selecting. What you might also want to do is to have a dropdowns options dynamically change based on a previous selection. And that's what we call dependent dropdowns. Now, the concepts behind the dependent dropdown is pretty straightforward. Try to imagine you have three different levels of data, where when the user selects an option from level one, it affects the options available in level two. And then when you select the options from level two, it affects the levels of option three. So that you can provide categories and subcategories for all the rows of data that you have in your spreadsheet. Now, you might see in some other tutorials that they're using something called an indirect formula in order to swap out the options within a dropdown. Now, while this is great, it only works for one dropdown at a time. If you want to use it for multiple dropdowns, you're not going to be able to use this formula. So instead, we're going to be using Google Apps Scripts, where we'll use an onEdit triggered event to listen for changes in the dropdowns. We're going to pull data from a map data set. We'll filter it based on the dropdown selections. We'll programmatically update the data validation rule for the target cell, and stay till the end for some tricks on how to improve the user experience.
Before we get started, we're going to need a dataset that maps the options together. I'm going to be using a table format, but there are other ways. If you have another format, I'd love to see what you're working with. Share it with us in the comments below. The first function we'll write is one that gets the map data. So we'll use the spreadsheet app.openById to get the spreadsheet object, and then we'll use the getRangeByName, get values in order to grab the data from the spreadsheet according to the named range. To name a range, select the area that you want to create a name range for, go to the data item in your menu bar, and then select name ranges. From there, you can name it whatever you want, and you'll be able to reference it by name as opposed to getting the range itself. Next, we'll write a function to filter out the items. We'll start with level 2 of our 3 levels, which in this case will be team. For testing purposes, we'll hardcode the department variable so that we can see the results. The script is going to use a for loop to iterate through all the map data and only return back the ones that match with the department. From there, it'll take the teams from those rows and push it into an array. Notice how we use new set down below before we return the array. This essentially removes any duplicates, which is a nifty trick for anyone looking to get unique values in their array. Now that we have a working script to filter by teams, it's time to connect it to a triggered event. First thing we're going to do is use an E in the parameter, which will grab data from the triggered array. We'll be getting the sheet by using e.source, and then the location of the cell by getting e.range.getRow and getColumn. We're going to use these values to determine if the change was made in the right place using an if statement that checks to make sure the sheet is a demo sheet, that the user is editing the department column, and that the column wasn't the header column, aka row 1. If all that passes, we'll grab the department they selected and then call our filter teams function to get the teams that match the department selected. In order to use the filter teams function in our get teams function, we'll have to update it so that it can accept parameters for department and data. To set the new validation rule, we're going to use something called spreadsheet app.newDataValidation. And that's going to be set to value in list, where we're going to pass through the filter down options that we grabbed earlier, and with a second parameter set as true to display it as a dropdown. We'll also create a new variable called target cell, which is going to be set equal to the next column in the same row, which we defined earlier. And once we have that, we'll take the target cell and use .setDataValidation to apply the new dropdown options to it. Now we'll create our triggered event in the app script editor, where we're going to select the function from the dropdown, and then we're going to set the event source as from spreadsheet, and then we're going to select onEdit as the event type. Going back to our spreadsheet, we'll set up the first column as a dropdown for the department using the data validation feature. And now, as we select options for department, the options for teams will dynamically change based on which department we selected previously. So we select finance, you can see that the teams change over to whatever is available in finance, which is different from what we have for engineering. To do this for the next level of dropdown options, we're going to reuse the filter teams code and alter it right slightly to include another comparison to make sure that both the selected department and selected team fields match up. We'll also reuse most of the code from the get teams to create our get roles function. We're going to have a couple of changes here though. In the if statement, we're going to check to make sure that the edit was done on the teams column. We'll also add a new line to get the team value selected. And we're going to change our range variable so that it calls the filter roles function instead of filter teams. We'll also adjust the get range of the target cell to target the third column for roles, while the code for building the validation rule stays the same. Once you add in a trigger for this new get roles function, like we did for get teams, you'll start seeing the options for roles change as you select the different teams. To take this to the next level, we're going to add in some quality of life features such as removing an input so that the user doesn't get an error message as they switch teams or roles or departments, and also giving the user a visual indication that the data is still being loaded so they're not confused when the old options are still being presented. To do this, we'll add a function called setCellState, which will take the parameters of target cell and type. If it's pending, we'll set the target cell to be blank and then its background color to gray. Once the options are done, then we'll turn the background color back to white so that the user knows it's ready to go. To make use of this new function, we're going to go back to our get teams and get roles function, and we're going to add it to the beginning and the end of our if statement blocks. That way, when it first triggers off, it'll clear out the cell and turn it gray, and once it's done setting up the new data validation rules, it'll turn the cell back to white.
For more automation techniques in Google Actors, make sure to check out this video and all the other videos we have on our channel.